hills around the Nigerian border with Cameroon are a renowned Boko Haram stronghold.
Attack after attack, Boko Haram, described by many countries as a terrorist organization, threatens to destabilize an entire Lake Chad Basin region.
After Nigerian Islamist militias attacked them, their target, these women, defenseless mothers.
Countries pull their military forces together against a common enemy. Yet the multinational joint task force operating in the Lake Chad Basin cannot battle terrorism alone, because as experts put it, terrorism is a local problem with global solutions.
Insecurity, Governor of Borno State, Babangida Zulum, is calling for a bold, full-scale joint military operation.
As Africa turns to the West with mixed results, then in strict adherence to the beneficial geopolitics and geostrategy, Russia steps in. In this interview for the Cameroon Radio Television, the CNR-TV, I explored the history of Africa-Russia military relations and their impact in the fight against terrorism and insecurity on the continent of Africa. My guest is Dr. Budi Raymond, a researcher on conflict in Africa with focus on Cameroon, which in the past decade has been confronted with a separatist armed conflict in its two English-speaking regions, and to the north, the Boko Haram incursions from neighboring Nigeria. Dr. Budi Raymond, you studied African international relations at the University of Bamenda in Cameroon. Take us through the deep military relations between the continent and the USSR, now Russia.
Thank you very much for bringing up this very topical area of discussion. You can trace this as far back as to 1896 during the Adowa incident. You know, the Adowa incident was the conflict between Ethiopia and Italy, where Ethiopian forces clashed with Italian colonial forces, defeating the Italian forces at the Battle of Adowa in 1896. During this war, Russian forces backed and supported the Ethiopian forces against Italy. This suggests that Russia had always been on the side of the defense of sovereignty of many African states. That is not all. If you come back even later to the 1960s, right up to the 1980s, you will see Russian forces supporting the ANC movement in South Africa to fight for the independence of that country. Even much later, you find again Russia intervening and supporting the MPLA in Angola to fight against the colonial forces and gaining independence for that country.
So since then, how have relations evolved when engaging with Africa in military and economic relations?
This relationship witnessed a period of inactivity, and that was particularly between 1991 and 2015. What was happening within this period was that the USSR had collapsed and Russia withdrew from Africa to focus on internal crisis. And so this allowed the West, particularly the US, France, to dominate Africa's security and economic sectors. But under Vladimir Putin, Russia has leveraged the historical liberation credentials that it has had to re-enter Africa. And today's narrative, which is largely echoed by the Institute of Security Studies in Africa, centers on Russia as a non-interfering partner that respects the sovereignty of African states, which is a direct contrast to the option of the West, which capitalizes on human rights-based conditionality to intervene in different aspects of African security life.
In 2022, Cameroon and Russia signed a military cooperation agreement spanning for about 5 years, with the aim to fight against Boko Haram and, to an extent, separatist threat in its English-speaking regions. Now, what is the content and context of this specific agreement?
This agreement was a renewal and an expansion of an earlier agreement that had taken place in 2015 between Cameroon and Russia. In 2022, April 12, 2022 to be precise, Cameroon is coming back to renew and expand an earlier 2015 agreement with Russia, which include the sale of advanced equipment, the maintenance of existing Soviet-era hardware, which of course makes up a large portion of Cameroon's arsenal at this time, and specialized training for the elite units like the Bataillon d'Intervention Rapide of Cameroon. So what we see here is they have been changing perspectives, changing narratives, and African countries have been steadily shifting from the West towards Russia because the latter does not condition its aid on the respect for human rights per se.
In terms of international military relations, does this agreement signal a major shift in Cameroon's military foreign policy options away from the West and towards Russia?
When you read some African think tanks like the Nkafu Policy Institute, it argues that the new trend of military cooperation between Cameroon in particular and Africa generally with Russia is about sovereign diversification. It is about sovereign diversification. It's not necessarily about discontinuing or withdrawing completely from relations with the West or from cooperations with the West. It is about diversifying. And that makes a very solid argument that Cameroon thinks that it is dangerous continuing to depend only on one partner, the West, for military cooperation. Is diversifying and moving towards Russia to get that done. And so the African core, which has absorbed the asset of the Wagner Group, represents Russia's former state-controlled military presence in Africa and in Cameroon, especially in the Lake Chad region.
How important is such Russian military assistance to Cameroon in the fight against Boko Haram and terrorism in the Lake Chad Basin?
For Cameroon, Russian intelligence and surveillance technology is a force multiplier against Boko Haram. And of course, unlike Western powers who may hesitate to provide certain lethal technology due to legislative hurdles, Russia provides it as a standard commercial military transaction. And so this is of very strategic importance to Cameroon and to many African countries.
Within a wider regional African context, Russia has instituted what is described as Africa Core. Between 2017 and 2021, therefore, Moscow signed military cooperation agreement with all of the G5 Sahel countries. Russia has also been active in the Central African Republic. How strategic is this presence on the continent and the fight against insecurity in Africa?
You will see that the Sahel region, the wider Sahel, including Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, they've steadily moved towards Russia because of similar reasons. While the West is bringing human rights conditionalities, Russia comes here not emphasizing human rights and all of that, and offers the military cooperation that would otherwise not have been gotten from elsewhere. The military cooperations between Africa, including Cameroon particularly, and Russia is not new. Russia has always presented itself as a non-interfering partner, that it is coming with no strings attached, as opposed to the West that comes with human rights and democracy conditionality to give assistance.
Thank you so much, Dr. Budi Raymond, who has been sizing up the importance of the Africa-Russia military relations in the fight against terrorism on the continent. I have been Kiloh Valery Nsalar for this interview for the Sahel TV, which sized up the military relations between Cameroon and Africa at large with Russia.